So our closing plenary is putting the voter first, exploring voter-centric reforms and election practices. And we have an illustrious panel. We have James Schwab, Chief Deputy Secretary of State for the Office of Secretary Alex Padilla. We have Kathy Darling-Allen, County Clerk, Registrar, Recorder for Shasta County. Deanna Kitamura, Voting Rights Project Director for Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. And Elba Gonzalez, Executive Director with Community Health Initiative, Napa County. And I'll go into their bios right before their presentations, but did want to highlight our panel. So when we began Future of California Elections over 8 years ago, this is our 8th conference, but we started a little bit before then. Over 8 years ago, the concept of the voter experience was just starting in the field. And I have been so impressed because throughout the day, I've heard about voter-centric reforms, really highlighting how do we make and improve the experience of voters for elections. And so it's amazing to close this conference today with a focus on 3 of the major reforms that have passed recently: the Motor Voter Act, same-day registration, and the Voters' Choice Act. And we saw these reforms in action for the first time, really, at a statewide level last election cycle. So we didn't really know if the policies were going to have their intended impact. Because as we all know, ideas can look great on paper, but once you implement them, you sometimes don't have the results that you hoped. And so I know we're still evaluating the full meaning of what we saw, and that's what our panel is going to be giving us today. They're going to talk to us about how these reforms have increased opportunities for registering and voting, how they performed in the last election cycle, and they're also going to talk to us about what's next for California elections, because where do we go from here? So with that, I wanted to go ahead and introduce our first presenter. Oh, and the way this panel's set up, I'm so excited about this, not just because we got to put together, but really we have James kicking us off with kind of a big overview, big picture, and numbers, because we love numbers. And then we're going to do a deep dive in each of the policies. Each of the leaders that you see before you are going to talk specifically about the policies that I outlined at the top. So we're going to have Kathy Darling-Allen talk to us about same-day registration, Deanna talk about language access and motor voter, and then Elba's going to close us up with Voters' Choice Act. So we're going to get to see kind of how these policies came to life in the field. So with that, let me introduce again James Schwab. James most recently served as Deputy Secretary of State for Policy and Planning, and now he is the Chief Deputy Secretary of State. And in his role, he oversaw the Voters' Choice Act. I believe he was referred to as the Godfather earlier. And he also oversaw New Motor Voter. And with that, James, take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'll start with a little story. So, I've been with Secretary Padilla since he was in the state Senate. And, when he was running for the office, it felt pretty easy, right? We're going to talk about voter registration, getting those numbers up, talk about voter turnout, getting those numbers up. Because California, as we all know, not too long ago was at the bottom for a lot of those numbers. And then 2016 happened. And a whole new role for election officials was put on our plate: cybersecurity. And that transformed our view of the world, that transformed what we had to do, that transformed how we have to allocate our time and resources. If you think about it, for most folks, someone who does IT in a state agency or city government, they're focused on setting your computer up, right? Or your work phone. Well, now they're responsible for defending your state agency from foreign actors, from cyber attacks. And so I start off with this because that's the new layer to our work and to county elections officials' work. So when we talk about all the work we're doing to increase voter turnout and voter registration, that's hard enough work that the Secretary of State and county election officials have to conduct. But now with these cyber threats and misinformation, it's a whole nother level, and so our work is even greater. And so in terms of, again, I think the Secretary kicked off this morning talking about resources for election officials. This is where it comes to, is making sure that we can both expand and protect the right to vote, but also protect our elections from those who seek to disrupt it. and I also want to clarify, and the Secretary mentioned this morning, is I want you to view cybersecurity in two different ways. One is the actual physical threats to voter databases, voting machines, and in terms of that, in 2016 or in 2018, we did not see any manipulation of votes or manipulation of voter registration databases. That's the good news. The bad news is we did see the misinformation, right? And the Secretary mentioned that. We ourselves, just our agency with our limited resources, found hundreds of posts of people, not just the basic posts of people trying to tell other folks, Democrats vote Tuesday, or Democrats vote Wednesday and Republicans vote Thursday. There's the misinformation in terms of the general divisiveness and, voter suppression of your vote doesn't matter or you shouldn't vote. We didn't even cover that. We just covered the basics of mechanics. And so going forward, we have a whole new role as election officials and election advocates is to consider that in our work. But for 2018, like I said, things went well on the technical side. On the misinformation side, we saw activity, and we expect that to ramp up again in 2020, and not just for elections, but for the census as well. So I wanted to start off with that because I think it puts into context that there's a lot more work than just voting rights that election officials do. I won't go over the turnout numbers too much because I think we've talked about that throughout the day. So I want to focus on one of the hot topics, which is the Voters' Choice Act. Now, for those of you that went through the legislative process on the Voters' Choice Act, it made the implementation part look easy. It made the legislation look easy, the implementation part. It was really hard to get that bill put together. It took 2 years of negotiations, 5-hour conference calls, but we got it done, we got signed into law, and then the implementation phase started. And that's where I think we learned a lot in the past 2 years of trying to implement the Voters' Choice Act. And so I'll go through some of the best practices and I think reminders and successes we saw in the VCA implementation. And it goes back to, I think, the core mission of FoCE is bridging the gap between advocates and county election officials and between county election officials. And that's what it took to really implement the Voters' Choice Act, is establishing networks within advocates in the counties, getting the counties to communicate with each other to share best practices, and then having the conversation between those groups in terms of implementation. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, everyone in this room has the best intentions for the voters. We have different thoughts, different methods, different approaches, but we're here for the same reason, and that's to increase participation in our democracy. And sometimes that gets lost in the conversations around where vote centers should go, or how your mailing is gonna look when it goes out to inform voters. And so sometimes that led to a lot of friction in the implementation of the VCA. And I want to suggest, and for the counties going in 2020 and for the counties that already went, we have to keep working at those relationships. It's an abusive relationship, but we're stuck with it if we want to succeed. And I want to get over that. I want to make sure that we understand we can work together. And when we work together, we saw successes. In Sacramento County, there was a collaboration that led to, I think, an awakening of, wow, yeah, the Sacramento County doesn't provide sufficient resources for their registrar's office. Let's work together to try to get more resources for the registrar's office. And so that's the point I want to see in 2020. And the success I think I saw in 2018 was those partnerships and collaborations coming to fruition. So I think that's step one is the collaboration. I think another success and important part of the VCA was learning how voters would react to the actual changes in voting. So you heard some of the numbers earlier today, and I'll point out one of the important ones is that traditional polling place voters, about 85% of them used their mail-in ballot to vote. They dropped it off, or they mailed it in, or they used a drop box or vote center. But 85% of polling place voters switched over to the new system. But it still leaves 15% of polling place voters that want to go in person. There's still a small percentage of vote-by-mail voters that went to a vote center. And they all showed up on election day. And one of the big lessons learned was we can give people 30 days to vote, they're still going to show up on election day. and we have to plan for that accordingly. And so in 2020, I think the messaging is, for counties that are going, is we have to look at that as vote centers on election day so that we can make sure that the way vote centers are set up, the way we intake voters is efficient. That's one of the big lessons learned, is that election day vote center experience was, I think, the challenge overall in the VCA. Some vote centers were fine, they ran smoothly. There were some vote centers that had huge lines, which was partly a good thing. For example, Sacramento State was the first college to have a vote center on the campus in California. They had lines all day long on election day of students doing conditional voter registration, right? So students who wouldn't be able to vote were voting. That's awesome, that's a great thing. But we need to improve that process, right? So we can make those, the students going to those vote centers the first time, make that experience much more smooth and much more enjoyable experience. So that's I think my takeaway from the Voters' Choice Act implementation and successes was the numbers were great, but we also created collaborations and new partnerships at the local level. And we learned some lessons on the voting experience and where we need to focus our attention, which is at the vote centers on election day. And there's a lot more to talk about, but I think my time's up and I'll pass it on down.
Hello. Okay, next we have Kathy Darling Allen. She has a couple of slides she's going to show us, so we're going to cue those up. And Kathy is the County Clerk Registrar of Voters for Shasta County. She has served since 2004 and is also one of the members of Future California Elections since it started, so thanks for sticking with us.
I have to stand up so I can kind of see my slides. Can you hand me my printout too? Sorry. So in Shasta County, we did not implement the VCA in 2018, and we're not going to do that in 2020 either, but we kind of cherry-picked some of the reforms included in VCA to allow us to serve our voters better, and so we're calling it VCA Light. Let's see, can I make this happen? Where am I pointing at? Nothing's happening. There we go. So just really quickly, I've been the Registrar of Voters in Shasta County since 2004, but prior to that, I worked for Four Seasons Hotels for over a decade while I was in school. And so I came to government service with a different mindset, perhaps, than other people who do this work. And so customer service is absolutely foundational, in my opinion, to how we deliver service to all of our customers, voters included. I'm super proud of my office. Where are you pointing at it to make it work? Straight in the back, okay. Oh, I'm so sad. All of my pretty animations. Can you click? Okay, so my office, before you click that again, we'll go ahead. Okay, now stop. Just really quickly, I want to share, I had an experience before I went to work for government where I went into a government office and watched two ladies have a conversation behind glass and ignore me for a good 3 minutes talking about their weekend and what they did before they turned to say, oh, and how can I help you? And I absolutely never ever wanted to have, number one, do that again, but also never wanted anybody who works for me to behave that way or treat any of our voters that way. So counterpoint to that, our office, go ahead and click through, we get thank you cards, we get flowers, we get cookies and donuts and cake, Gail, we get cake sometimes. Keep going. And I have to really give all the credit to my staff. But I share this because I think it demonstrates how important that customer service aspect is to us, and VCA pieces, implementing these pieces of the VCA allow us to serve our voters better, which is what we want to do. So go ahead and thank you so much. So Shasta County, so you understand where we are, north part of the state, you drive 2 hours north from Reading, our county seat, and you're in Oregon. We are primarily Republican. You can see we're 46,000 Republicans to 23,000 Dems, 25,000 and continuing to increase of nonpartisan voters, right? Like everybody else. But our demographics are very different from where the population centers are in California. So I just wanted to point that out to you. Our average voter is 61 and a half years old. And we cover not quite 4,000 square miles. And of that 3,800 square miles, 72 square miles is water. So lots of lakes. Come up and run a houseboat. We'd love to see you on Shasta Lake. Go ahead. So economics are important when you talk about our county. We don't have any money. That's all. We just don't have any money. So when I went to the board and said, we'd like to do VCA, they said, that's great. If you can do it for free, go crazy. I'm elected, so I didn't need their permission, but I do need their budget, right? I need some money to make this happen. So here we are. So we're 100,000 voters. 72,000 of those vote by mail already. Another 4,000 or so are in all-mail precincts. So we are already serving the majority, the vast majority of our voters as vote by mail voters. And again, implementing those pieces of VCA that we can only makes sense for us. So the first thing that we did that I'm most proud of, and Joanna Francesca, stand up, sorry, this was her idea, and it's the first time anybody did it in the state, and I'm pretty sure we're gonna have a lot of other people copying Joanna's great idea, and that's a provisional hotline. So what that means is when you go in to vote, your name's on the roster, you're in the right place, but we sent you a ballot and the dog ate it. And normally we would make you vote a provisional ballot, right? Joanna's idea, because this was allowed under the VCA, well, under 3015, which is amended as part of the package of implementation rules. So we had poll workers call the office and tell us who the voter was that was standing in front of them. If we had not received their ballot, we immediately voided that ballot in our system, allowed that voter to sign in and vote a regular ballot. So this is a huge, huge deal. You can go ahead and click. So we were able to serve people the way they wanted to be served, right? Huge, huge deal as far as I'm concerned. This is a little grid here that shows you provisional ballots over time in the even year November elections. We didn't track how many people came into the polls and said, I'm a vote by mail voter, I need a provisional. In 2012, that's why the bars all the same color. But for the other three elections, we tracked those vote by mail voters who came in and had to vote provisionally. You can see in 2016, there were over 1,500 people who had to vote a provisional ballot. And even in 2018, it wasn't a perfect implementation. Not all the poll workers got the memo, right? So we still had several hundred of those that we had to process. But if you go to the next slide, we answered 1,700 phone calls that day. Three deaths in a row. You can see our beautiful girls here who at almost 8 o'clock at night were still smiling, which is a minor miracle. And I'm just gonna go, because I don't have a lot of time left, I'm sure. Just gonna go to the last bullet point there, which is that a member of the public got to, through this process, interact with their government, get what they wanted, leave happy, satisfied, no coming back to fill out more forms, no filling out a provisional envelope, no filling out another card, another form. This doesn't happen a lot. I'm super excited about it, that we can, as government, offer people on the spot satisfaction and give them what they need. So we're really excited about that. So go ahead, sorry. So we also implemented ballot drop boxes in 2012. This is what we sent out to voters in that year, and we've expanded that quite a bit. In November of 18, we were super excited that Nevada County paved the way with drop boxes in grocery stores. Thank you, Nevada County. Well, that little tiny grocery chain that only has one store in Nevada County has 5 stores in my county. So we got to get all of their stores have ballot drop boxes in them. And the best part is we learned from Sacramento counties, where are you, implementation, that having drop boxes available for a short amount of time or time that's less than polling hours doesn't really work, right? Those grocery stores are open from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. We were so excited about it. So, yeah, we mailed that insert out to a million voters, not a million voters, obviously, but if you go to the next, you're right, you're there. So this is what we sent out at a special election in March. This is the information we sent out to those folks who voted at the March special election. 9 locations. This helps the voters not pay postage, and now that counties have to pay postage, it's going to help us too, not pay postage for all those people who use these drop boxes. You can click through. This is just a map showing you where the boxes are around our county. Go ahead. So Dropbox usage, these are just some numbers. There's a lot. I mean, you can see that when we started in 12, it's gone way up in 18. I expect that to continue. Go ahead. We also offered early voting in the office, another VCA component, which we hadn't done in the past. We're excited about that. And then the next one is conditional voter registration, which of course everybody's offering. The one thing that we are going to try, and we did for March, but we only had 5 conditional registrations in March, so it was a kind of a dry run. But Monterey County pioneered a VIP room for conditional voter registration. So basically they took all that conditional voter registration traffic, which were the lines in November of 18, those lines, they were all conditional voter registrants, or 90%, right? So we've taken that process and taken it away from our front counter and put it into our conference room on the 2nd floor so that we can send voters to be taken care of in a place that's away from traffic. And then, as you might have noticed, I'm also the county clerk, and on election day, of course, more than normal people want to get passports and get married. Don't ask me why on election day. So this way we can move those conditional voter registration folks upstairs and away from our other stuff. Go ahead. What else do we got? Numbers about how many CVR voters. 417 in November. And then the next slide, Gail already showed you a slide like this, so she stole my thunder. The next one is another VCA component is that you can drop your ballot off at any place in the state. So those are all the different colored, the rainbow ballots that Gail was talking about, the rainbow envelopes of all the ballots that were dropped off with us on election day. And then the last slide, this is my amazing staff in their early Christmas sweaters, although my sweater is the best. As you can see, the llama on the front. But this and this room as well is a great reflection of the fact that none of us do this job alone. We have amazing teams, all of us that are talking to you today, but also, you know, all of you are a huge component in how we get this job done and done well. Thank you.
Great. Our next speaker is Deanna Kitamura, Voting Rights Project Director with Asian Americans Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And Deanna works on issues related to language access and voter protection.
Well, I'm not actually Asian Law Caucus, but I'm with Asian Americans Advancing Justice LA.
I know that.
Yeah. That's okay. It's confusing. So James talked about how everyone in this room is interested in improving the voter experience. And so I wanted to start off with some stats to remind us that we have to think about the needs of all the voters and not just the needs of the folks in this room. And I have some new stats thanks to my colleague Jonathan Stein, and that is that in California there are over 11 million Latino and Asian Americans who are eligible to vote. 24% or 2.7 million identify as limited English proficient. And so the main theme that you're going to quickly see me talk about is that we need to conduct field testing and we need to think about how to tailor the outreach and education that we do. The first thing I want to focus on is the new voter motor program. And there's a lot of information to unpack. There's been a lot of good and some not so good that has happened. But what I really want to focus on is the customer experience, excluding the long lines that happened in April, the first few months. I'm part of a stakeholder group, a DMV stakeholder group that the ACLU leads, and we had been meeting for over 2 years before the launch of the new motor voter program. And prior to DMV's release of the system, the Center for Civic Design tested the voter registration portion of the DMV system, just the voter registration portion. They tested that in English and 3 other languages. They made recommendations. Some of those tweaks were made, and some of them we're hoping will be made in the next version. But the field testing and the tweaks really did work. My organization conducted a survey of some bilingual DMV customers in LA County after the new motor voter system was released last year. And that was thanks to a grant that we received from the ACLU and CSME. The customers we surveyed said that the voter registration portion of the driver's license application was the easiest part of the application. They said by far it was the easiest part. And again, that's because it had been tested. And they made some additional recommendations, very consistent with those that the Center for Civic Design had made. And so again, hopefully those will be made. No doubt that the voter registration numbers are beyond most of our wildest expectations, but I want to point out one issue. Although our surveyed customers were able to complete transactions in English and Spanish, none were able to complete the process in an Asian language once they went up to the DMV window. And one of our customers, who is fluent in English and Spanish, when she was filling out she went to the touch screen and she was filling out the application, she noticed an elderly monolingual Spanish speaker really struggling. And so she helped him on the first screen. Then she started her process and she finished. And then she turned around and she saw that he was still struggling. And so she ended up completing the entire application for him. And so we really need to think about the whole system, right? Again, the voter registration portion was the easiest part, but we need to think about the whole system from the beginning to the end. And that leads me to the VCA, because we can think about it from the beginning to the end, because the registrar of voters that are in this room have to be thinking about it from the beginning to the end. We saw from David Becker's charts earlier today that vote-by-mail ballot use is high. Is high in vote center counties, and that's not surprising. Whether that means they're dropping it off or mailing it in. My organization did a vote-by-mail study of the November 2016 election, and we did this because we knew that VCA was going to happen, and we knew that vote-by-mail was likely to become used more frequently than before, and so we wanted to understand what that meant to the Asian American community. And so I just want to go over a little bit of the data that we had found, and the study that we have is on our website. The data analysis was done by my former colleague, Joanna Lee, but it's inspired by vote-by-mail studies by Mindy Romero and by Kim Alexander. In 2016, use of vote-by-mail ballots by Asian American voters in the counties that we had researched was higher than average. And you can see in this chart that Vietnamese Americans' use was the highest, and that was at 72%. But we also saw that vote-by-mail rejection rates were the highest in Asian American communities. And if you can see this, it's nearly all of the Asian ethnicities were higher than average. And when you account for age and nativity, we saw that young foreign-born voters had the highest rejection rate. In one county that we looked at, the rejection rate was 3% in this group. And remember, this is before VCA, so these are voters who actually signed up to be vote-by-mail ballot users. And think about the people to the right. Maybe some of these people have been voting for decades using a vote-by-mail ballot, right? And they've been rejected. We don't know how often. The reasons for rejection, this is a very complicated chart, I know that, so let me just explain the bottom line here. And that is, this chart shows that nearly every Asian ethnicity, for every Asian ethnicity, the main reason for rejection was signature mismatch. And so fortunately, the law has since changed, and now voters can correct that, they can confirm their signature. So hopefully these numbers have gone down. But the point that I want to make is that we really do need to think about the signature instructions that we provide and the education that we provide to voters, especially when we're changing a system that's actually going to increase the use of vote by mail. So this slide shows LA County's LA County's revised vote-by-mail ballot, which was first used in this last election. And prior to use, they did field testing, and after that, they surveyed voters on the experience. The survey results indicated that the voters, including those who are using the translated ballots, they all, for the most part, appreciated the new vote-by-mail ballots. And because voters, and another point I want to make is that because we saw that voters, well, I want to point out that, we have to really think about the voter education. As I mentioned, the highest rejected group was foreign-born 18 to 24-year-olds. And so we have to think, how do we target that group? I was recently talking to a coworker in that demographic group, and he told me he does not own a TV. He watches everything online. I doubt that he listens to the radio. And so we really have to think about how are we reaching out to him. We have to think about social media. We have to think about, I'm glad we heard Karthik talk about tweets. I know that Jonathan Stein in the last session talked about Facebook ads. We also have to think about, the Chinese community uses WeChat. We need to figure out how to plug into that as well. And I'll just quickly talk about, LA County is going to implement a new system in March. It's going to be very different from how we've been voting in the past. They've done focus groups. Here's the focus group being tested a couple of years ago. They did testing in English, Spanish, and Korean, and they're going to have a mock election in September. But the one thing I want to point out here is that you see that button on the bottom where it says, touch this to start. Initially, it only said that in English. It didn't say it in any other language. And I was on a committee, and I said, well, shouldn't we translate that as well? And the tech people for this, the consultant was like, it's only one button. People have phones. They know they need to push the one button there. And I thought, yeah, they're probably right. But then when we did that focus group, one after another of these elderly monolingual Korean speakers were saying, what do I do? What do I do next? So we have to remember that we can't make assumptions when we're making any shifts, and we have to test, and we have to remember how to do outreach to the communities that need it. Thank you.
Great, and our final panelist is Elba Gonzalez-Mares. She's the Executive Director with Community Health Initiative NAPA, and Elba is also the Chair of the Board of California Coverage and Health Initiatives and a Commissioner with First 5 NAPA's Children and Family Commission. And also I have to add, she's been a champion for integrating civic engagement and voter access in her family services work, so offers a really great model of how to do that.
Hey! Hi, Dora. The clicker, okay. Okay, so yeah, I'm here to talk about the Napa County experience. Not necessarily about wine, but I do love wine. But I hear there's a networking after this, so we can chat about that later. So a little bit about our work with the Voters' Choice in Napa. Starts with our coalition. So I can't really dive into that until I really share with you our local experience. Since the 2016 elections, a group of nonprofits and several community leaders came together to build a community leadership coalition. And this coalition came about to address what had happened in the elections, and there was sort of this need of advocacy and civic engagement. That group strives to be well-informed and actively engaged in collective solutions that addresses our community concerns. There's more than 20 organizations that participate in that, and this includes representatives from nonprofit sector, education, law enforcement, county departments, faith-based organizations, and also the community at large. It was also really important that this coalition represented our diverse geographic area, so from North Napa all the way to South, and have representatives from those communities. And that it was really important and very clear to those participating that this was a nonpartisan group, and that a big portion of this had to do with advocacy. However, many of us nonprofits and organizations, from the schools to government and mainly in those who provide services services to our vulnerable populations, really hadn't stretched our advocacy arm that much. And it was sort of this new thing for everyone, and almost nerve-wracking for even some organizations to participate in this coalitions, because they're like, oh, civic engagement, I don't know, that sounds like that might go against our nonprofit rules, and we can't advocate. And so it was, as soon as we were getting that, we're like, okay, we have to do a little bit more training. So even before we could dive into voters' choice and all of that, we provided a training where we brought an expert in an advocacy. We knew there were associations and 501c4s, and we knew that they did that, but also at the local level and nonprofits and faith-based and all these organizations, that they could stretch that arm and they could use that as a tool to advocate for the clients that we are serving, right? These are nonprofits that are working with organizations that are clients are facing food insecurity, housing, and it all comes back to like making sure there's the right people at the table. And how do you have the right people at the table? Well, you vote. And you need to have your voice heard. So it was really important for us to do that. So having this group already established, right, VCA happened, so I'm not going to go over what VCA is, you all know that, is how do we reach out to our underrepresented communities? Again, our group, that's the focus, that's who we work with on a day-to-day basis. My organization does healthcare. My mission is to ensure that everyone has access to healthcare, and we do that through health insurance. But for every application that my staff helps out with, we have to ask our clients, and with much pleasure we will do that, if they're registered to vote, and if not, do they need help with that? So it's also about staff empowerment. My team was ready to help. Many of my nonprofits were ready to help. We just didn't know how to go about doing that. And we wanted to address all of these areas, right? So language minority communities, our Spanish, Filipino, Tagalog community, voters with disabilities, youth vote, making sure our geographic area is being outreached. And all of this collective input was going to help us advocate in ways that we hadn't done before. And that's through making changes to the election administration plan, which, by the way, happened shortly after the 2017 Napa fire complex. So we were addressing what was happening with the fires, and at the same time we're like, what's an EAP and how do you advocate for an EAP? But we had a lot of support to help us through that portion of it, and really be very strategic about it. But because of having the right representation and the diversity of our community at the table, we were able to accomplish a lot of that input in order to provide feedback to our election divisions, in order to make sure that that it was equitable access for underserved populations. This is a really cool day for us. This was the second day. We had one in South Napa and one in North Napa. We decided to train our key people in our community, and about 75 staff were trained, and these were all representatives from faith-based, nonprofit, education, government, and business. And it just really energized people to really get involved, because these are, again, organizations that are really meeting those that we're trying to grow with the VCA, right? So get the youth out, get our seniors out, get our language minority communities out there. Great way to connect was our website, resources we could share, so communication was super important around the Valley. This is one slide that I really want to spend most of my time on, is that it was really starting from scratch to build a partnership with our elections division. And this partnership is now going on to 2 years, and there's still a lot to work on together. There's been a lot of growth on both ends of the sides of collaborating and coming together. The election administration plan, we continue to try to understand how that works. It was really important for us in our collective from the very beginning that both of us, when I say both, like the coalition of VCA and also the election divisions, have some straight up like agreements from the get-go. And because of what had just happened with the fires, there was this momentum and need of making sure that there was information available in all languages, and that the information was coming out simultaneously, that it wasn't just an afterthought, like here it is in English, oh, by the way, here it is in Spanish. And this is emergency surviving, right, during the fires. But this was something that our community brought up, and it was very strong, and about making sure that this was going to happen throughout all kinds of communications. So when the EAP plan was being proposed, that was something that we wanted to agree and that we would support, because we knew also our elections division didn't have the total capacity to do all of that in order to make sure it wasn't only translated, but that it was culturally sensitive and accurate and competent to our community. So that was an agreement that we had from the get-go. Also, continuing on with monthly meetings, those were making sure that, again, people from, because Napa's a rural community, so we wanted to make sure that there was representation from everyone and was able to make it to those meetings, so make it accessible to that. And that also that there were the open channels to provide feedback. One of the big things for us was really advocating to have the drop boxes. To me, it's music to my ears to hear that they were able to have them at the grocery stores. That's something that we wanted to happen, but our first attempt actually was just to make sure that our drop boxes were all exterior drop boxes. The original plan was that it was going to be interior and inside government buildings. So right, October, middle of the fires, we're looking at the EAP plan and we're like, yeah, that's not going to work. And so trying to communicate with that, meet. They were very open about it and receptive about it. You know, there was a lot of communication, and I know our election divisions officer knows us very well, and we know that we are still in that contact and that thread of continuing to work those details out. Also, postage. We were just right from the get-go wanting to know what's the budget, what's the postage. We wanted to be paid for it, and it was sort of this like, no, it's okay. You know, the postage knows that they can bill us. Don't tell anyone, but it's something that you know, if you submit it and it doesn't get paid, you know, if there's no stamp, it's okay. And I literally was like, oh my gosh, I don't think I've ever put a postage on mine, you know, like, has my vote ever been taken? So just, if I felt that uncertainty, we just wanted to increase the transparency, right? And so continuing to build that transparency in our local community. And again, it was open, and then our Board of Supervisors supported that, and they actually, before anything could happen during the summer, I believe, it was when we got it passed where they paid for the postage. So we're really excited about that. So advocating, going to Board of Supervisors meetings, going to public comment was important for us. And again, it keeps going. We just submitted another letter to our elections divisions, really this beautiful chart just lining up everything that we'd like to see happening still. And one of them is also, you know, increasing the number of bilingual workers at the sites. So you all know that on that day, there was a line, and so it was in Napa as well. And that's really exciting. And we wanted to continue to do that, but continue to get ready. And we know that these are challenges that we can only overcome together. And I also understand, right, this is new for a lot of us, and it's new for our elections divisions that now, you know, they know they've held an important role, but now more so than ever. And that they can't accomplish that alone, right? And so for us, it was really important for them to know that you're not alone, right? You're not alone. We are here to support you. There's this very strong network of organizations that have the trust of the community to relay that message. And when you have that trust, that is such an important asset. And we want to be there, but we want to build that message together, and we want to build that communication together. However, there are certain things that as organizations and as organizers that it's, you know, it's different when, you know, government is government, but we have to find some of those lines of compromise in order to move forward. And so we really are looking forward. We meet monthly. We're continuing to meet. And like I said, an email was just sent out on behalf of all of us, of all of our community and the diverse members of our community to ask for more, right? That there's more that we want to see. So that's just a little bit about what we're doing. Thank you.
So now you can see why I was excited about this panel, right? So we heard from James how the Secretary of State's office is going to be supporting a lot of this implementation and how they did. We heard from Kathy what a VCA light model looks like. Everybody's going to coin that term. And then we heard from Deanna how important it is to not make assumptions about voters and how testing is really critical because we don't know the experience of every constituent in our jurisdictions. And then we heard from Elba the importance of of partnerships, truly, and reaching out and not being limited if you're not an election organization, but really how do you integrate this model into the work that you do as you serve others. And so I wanted to first thank our panelists, because those were all such great insights. But I have so many questions, but I know that James left us on the hook because he says we didn't give him enough time for vote centers. So I kind of want to give him a few minutes, or 2 minutes, to talk to us about the vote centers, because you didn't get to touch on that. So I know you said that your strategy moving forward, because now I want to shift the conversation about what's next. So you mentioned your strategy was going to be on vote centers. And then please write down your questions. We're going to collect the cards in a minute.
Vote centers, very broad topic. So I think what was interesting, I mean, there's a lot of things to talk about with vote centers, but one I would talked about was that folks still showed up on election day. But if you take a step back, roughly half the voters had already turned in their ballots either by mail or drop-off before election day, and roughly half on election day dropped off or came into a vote center. And one of the things I think we need to look at more closely is why people decided to go to one vote center over another. And I don't have an answer for that. I don't think the folks who have done the research do either. But that's something we need to research. And part of that is putting those processes in place at the county level to understand where someone came from and what vote center they use. Some counties I think are tracking that, but not all of them. So that you can tell that if I use this drop box, it's a mile within my home or it's near my work. So I think that's one of the important aspects we can understand of why certain vote centers are used more than others. And that'll help the counties mitigate. Maybe they need a bigger facility, maybe they need multiple facilities. Although even when there's facilities like pretty close to each other, within a couple minutes drive or walk, one would be jam-packed, another one would not be. So that was an interesting observation. So I think understanding, we have 14 criteria that determine where the vote centers go. And figuring out which of those criteria maybe is more helpful than another, more relevant than another, I think is something we need to find out for 2020 and beyond. So I'm looking forward to understanding that better. The other important thing about vote centers is if you provide more locations for same-day voter registration, folks are going to take more advantage of that. And that's what we saw with the vote center counties, where they extremely outperformed the rest of the state in terms of same-day voter registration. And I think that was the piece that led to some of the lines at vote centers, was it's a little bit of longer of a process to do same-day registration at a vote center because you have to register to vote, get your ballot, vote. And I don't think we thought that many people would show up and take advantage of it. And so I think having a more streamlined, a more efficient check-in process and CVR process same-day registration process will be important going forward in 2020, taking that into consideration. The other part too, and this was a struggle from the very beginning, was actually identifying the right locations that were accessible, near public transportation, that met the 14 criteria, and now that we know, large enough in space. And we passed a law recently that now says that public facilities have to be open for vote centers if the registrar gives enough heads up to that facility. But the challenge of finding the right location is going to be a headache for any county, even the ones that are going again from 2018 into 2020. Finding the space, finding the location, making sure the community is comfortable with that location. It could be any location, but if you don't understand how the community feels about it, it might not be the right space. And that was one of the interesting parts when we visit different counties, is some of the feedback registrars were getting was that we didn't feel comfortable at City Hall. That's a very valid concern that folks need to take into account when putting a vote center. But then they'd hear from another group was, we love City Hall, let's put the vote center in City Hall. And so mitigating some of those mixed feedback they get from the communities is another thing a registrar goes through. And so identifying the right space that communities are comfortable going to is, I think, another challenge going forward. And I think we did something right with it a little bit in 2018. And I'm sure people complained about locations, but I think overall we found the right spaces. It's just a matter of sort of tweaking, perfecting those spaces to be more efficient and effective for voters. And we know that if you put a vote center on a college campus, it's going to be a huge success. And I wish, is anyone from Sacramento State here? No. So tomorrow at our VCA debrief, the student body president at Sacramento State, who also was a former student assistant in our office, led the charge on promoting the vote center on campus. And what was most helpful, and this is the challenge on college campuses, is they had support of the administration. The government affairs folks at Sacramento State were awesome. They were so helpful. They were great partners to the student body, and we made it a huge success at Sac State. And it's a challenge, because college campuses are where you want to put vote centers. That's where a lot of registrars want to put them. But finding the right people to open the doors for that registrar or for the community is going to be a challenge as well. I'm already hearing that feedback from registrars' offices. And so we need that community collaboration to reach out to the college campuses. Not just get the chancellor or whoever's the head on the campus, you need to find the right people in the bureaucracy to find that location. I know I'm getting into the weeds a little bit here, but this is an important part because college campuses are such an important place to put vote centers. I think one of the other factors too in terms of looking at are we putting vote centers in the right locations is what came up in Sacramento County is vote centers that can cater to the homeless population, because they're not going to pop up on the 14 criteria that are used to identify where vote centers are. So in Sacramento County, there's a location that services many of the homeless in the area, but it doesn't pop up on any of those 14 criteria. And so getting a vote center there would be a great idea, but there's a lot of challenges with that. And I know that's an idea I've heard come up in other counties too. Sometimes the spaces that cater to the homeless, they don't have the space for a vote center. They might not be accessible. They might not have the infrastructure for a vote center. And so coming up with creative ways and ideas to service those communities is going to be important. So those are just some of the factors even that go into vote centers. There's a lot to talk about. Right.
Definitely. Thanks, James, for that nice summary of that. And since we're on the topic of voters' choice, Alba, I did want to ask you about something you brought up in your presentation, which is that for your community, drop boxes inside the government offices did not work. And then James mentioned that election offices have to sort out the information of what they're hearing from one community group versus another community group. How would you advise election officials to listen to their community to improve that voter experience?
Definitely, our group is one way. I know that we also used one of the tools that could identify areas in our community where there was eligible but not registered voters, especially with those ages and our Latino population or Filipino Tagalog speaking population. And I think just continuing to have that dialogue, and it's been ongoing. So we managed to get them exterior. The locations of those sites are still a work in progress. We really strongly advocated to have one in our, we don't have a university, but we have a community college. And we weren't able to do that in the college. I'd actually had committed to even help pay for the Dropbox. So that's something that we are still working on. So I think it's continuing to bring those resources and continue to have that dialogue and to show those numbers. The data that's been shared is so important to us. And now that we've had one round of VCA, and to hear the successes and to see those pictures with those lines, that's the kind of stories that is going to help build our case to say, look, this is something that's not only would be an impact to our community, but that's already been happening across the board. And then continue to make sure that, with everything that is going on with competing priorities in our community, to continue to make sure that we are engaging our more north side and our south side of the valley in having those that input and that perspective, and keeping those channels open to make sure the election division knows that they're really not alone. And I do give kudos to our elections officer, because there was definitely some moments where we were pushing, and there was a lot of listening happening, and good things happened as well, but we're just not there where we would like to be. And as long as that channel is open, which it still is, that's still very exciting for us.
Great. Deanna, you mentioned testing as a really important part to get the right messages, to know how to go through the right rollout of a reform as important as motor voter, but testing is very expensive, field testing. And so if you can't do testing, what's an alternative? What are partnerships that exist for that, to get that information about the right messaging?
Well, I think the first place to go is to the LACs and the BACs that the counties have, and those are the community members, and they should be able to provide pretty good feedback if you have people who are really connected to the community.
Yep. And those are the language accessibility advisory bodies and the voters with accessibility advisory bodies as well. Thanks, Deanna. That's a great starting point. And Kathy, you gave us such an out-of-the-box way of approaching the VCA. I mean, the fact that you even call it VCA Lite, right? We knew that we had all of these reforms happening in 2018, and now we can package them for a community advocate or an election office that wants to start a kind of a VCA Lite model. What's an easy first step they could take?
The drop boxes are probably the best, the easiest and most accessible thing you can do in the beginning. Making sure those are situated in places that are easy access to folks. Honestly, drive-through. If you have a place in your county, you can put a drive-through box. Oh my gosh, we have one. Our Reading City Hall has a big circular roundabout in the front, and they have a utility drop box for utility payments in the front already on that roundabout, and they offered us the opportunity to put another pad, a cement pad next to it, and we put a exterior drop box that's permanently installed there, and that is by far our most popular drop box. It gets 4 or 5 times what all the other drop boxes get. Every election, we have to empty it literally every hour on election day. It's unbelievable. If we could, we probably should put a bigger one in that spot and take that smaller box and put it somewhere else because we really do spend a lot of time actually emptying it now, but that's a very accessible, kind of easy grab.
And I had a question. What was the name of the grocery store chain that?
Oh, it's Holiday Markets. Which is not only it's in Nevada County, Glenn County. It's a North State grocery chain. They also operate Save More.
Great. So I have a combo question here. So this is for the panel. There was a lot of concern about the potential for the VCA to disenfranchise voters, especially underrepresented voters. And we know that some of the counties going forward in 2020 are a bit different than the counties that went in 2018, in the sense of there's lower use of vote by mail. So how would you recommend to both advocates and election officials, how do we make sure that that disenfranchisement does not happen? Easy question. Just kidding.
So I think the numbers we saw this morning from the researchers are positive in terms of the impact of the VCA, but I think we're going from 7% of the population to now 50% of the population in a VCA county. And the outlier also in 2020, not to single them out, but Los Angeles County is a slightly different model than the other VCA counties, and they're required to have more vote centers, but don't have to send everyone a ballot. So I think the key is the civic engagement part of side of things, so that the community understands the changes that are happening. You can identify the trusted messengers and start getting the word out that things are changing, things are happening. So investing heavily in that community engagement is important, and finding partners. Investing in the public education side of stuff is important too. But the interesting part, we did a survey after the first June election about where folks got their information, and overwhelming majority said the voter information guide from the county was the place where they got their information from. Who knew people actually read that, right? So I think it's important to invest in a nice design for your voter information, the county voter information guide, as well as the materials you put into the vote by mail pamphlet. I think those are 2 key things to include when to focus on when doing the VCA and making sure voters get the message. Translations, that's an important part too, is getting the translations right. A translation can change from region to region. The way they might want to have it translated in Northern California might be different than the way they want to translate it in Southern California. And so coming up with translations that have been vetted by the communities that you're trying to serve is important. Disability access to vote centers, making sure all your vote centers, they're required to be accessible, but making sure you have a strong checklist to make sure they do meet accessibility standards is important. Making sure you're promoting, we didn't talk about it much today at all, was remote accessible vote by mail, which is another big reform that we passed in California, which helps serve voters with disabilities. And it's hard to understand the utilization of it. We knew that very few people used it in 2018. So the question is, why didn't they? Because we know there's more voters out there that can take advantage of it. So promoting that is another way to make sure that populations that might be disenfranchised by changes to the law have a chance to be educated and be engaged.
Does anybody else want to add to that?
I encourage counties to experiment with their outreach. Clearly, talk to the community when you're doing that and when you're creating something. You know, LA County is doing a little experiment by itself right now. It's actually conducting outreach through community partners. So they divided up the county into 33 different regions, and they're having community groups actually lead the outreach and workshops in those different regions. There's been already one round of workshops that were conducted, and we're about to have a second round of workshops. And those workshops are not only to introduce the VCA model, but also to get people's input, get the community input in terms of where the vote centers should be placed. And then also LA County is going to have a mock election in September, and there's going to be outreach done there, and people will be able to see what a vote center is going to be like prior to the March primary. And so those kind of innovative types of experiments are what I would suggest counties try.
Anybody else? Okay. Just time for one last question. And that is, we've been talking about these reforms and implementation, and we've heard a lot of success, but what's next? Where do we go from here in terms of continuing to improve that voter experience? Maybe a final thought from each of our panelists, and then we'll wrap up.
So I think it's what we're doing today. I think for the next number of cycles, it's reviewing and perfecting the laws we put into place. The past couple of years, we've put a lot of laws on the books. I mean, stuff we haven't even talked about today, like the signature mismatch law that you can now fix it. A lot of little things that just got signed into law have nothing to do with the VCA. And perfecting those laws, evaluating them, kicking the tires, making sure that we get them right. Because we have a lot of the best practices that you can identify are on the books in California, and so it's about perfecting those laws. But I think in the broader sense of what's next, what's in the future, is we're working hard to remove the barriers to registration and voting. But there's another part to civic engagement and getting people to participate, and that's getting people to believe in the system, getting people educated about why they should vote, how they should vote. I think it was, I'm totally going to butcher this quote, that it was MLK who said, it's important to give someone the right to vote, but also it's important to give them something to vote for. And when you talk to young people, part of the process is demystifying the process. This is how you vote. This is the mechanics of voting. And that's what we've been focused on. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to get the mechanics right. But what we haven't talked about too much yet is restoring people's faith that the vote matters, right? About my vote counts, it means something. Why I should vote for school board, why I should vote for Congress, why I should vote for governor. And that vested interest, there's actually a benefit in voting, I think is something that we need to focus on next. That's remove those barriers, and we sort of get that off the table. It's about the rest of the reasons why people don't participate in elections.
For our group, continuing to work with our election division and the EAP, we also would like to have drop boxes at the grocery stores and on our campus, and that's something that's in our agenda, and continue to work on that. But what we're also seeing is that because there's just a lot of first-time voters that we're getting in touch with, is just having the capacity and the training about voter education, and how can we train our own team and staff to feel very comfortable and confident about this, to therefore teach someone how does local elections work, and why should that, why does that matter? And it, they know it matters to them, they just haven't had the education piece. Because once you lay it out to them, then the connection happens. It's actually quite inspiring to see that connection happen in front of you. And then absolutely working with our youth. There is a lot of momentum with our youth. We actually had a really fun event in one of our high schools where we had our Secretary of State participate, and you had a lot of teenagers pre-registering to vote, and just seeing that energy, continuing to build that energy at our local level is really, really important to us. And really, is the next step is just really, getting our team ready to understand how to capacitate themselves, and also how do we educate our community about civic engagement.
We heard from Secretary Padilla, as well as from James, the numbers of people who are getting registered to vote through the new Motor Voter program. With the new leadership there, I'm hoping that there will be better language access, so people will be able to have a good experience when they're getting registered to vote, and that they're doing it properly. That's the first thing. And then the other thing I would hope for is that right now, the counties that have the Voters' Choice Act implemented, those voters get to have conditional voter registration anywhere, right? Well, hopefully, SB 72 will pass, and then we can have conditional voter registration throughout California, so that it's not just the certain county voters that are able to benefit from that.
I made a note about how to answer this question, and I don't know where it is.
Impromptu is always the best, right?
So I'm gonna plead no voice.
Okay, all right. Well, I can't really conclude it better than what our panelist says. I think the work is still ahead of us. I think we've had a lot of success, and I'm so glad we took the day to look at the numbers and the data to see the success of that policy. And I know there's so much more to look forward to. So if you would please help me in thanking our panelists for sharing their expertise with us. And with that, I wanted to close with two words that really come to mind. The first is gratitude. Looking out, I see a lot of faces still in the room, which is a good sign. I think that means that you all like the content, that you all like the presentations, and that you care about our democracy and want to continue learning how do we strengthen it. So thank you for staying here the whole day. So applause to you. Thank you to all of our speakers, some that participated in several panels throughout the day, to our volunteers, to my amazing colleagues, Rachel and Callie, to our FoCE members who engage with us throughout the year, and our advisory board and our committee. I'm getting the wave to remind you to please fill out the evaluations, because we do take those into consideration as we continue planning our conference. And if you liked the conference in Sacramento, let us know. We want to continue making sure that we are available to everyone, and changing it up is always great. And then I said I had two words. The second word I have as a theme for today is trust. We heard a lot about that theme. We heard that we need to build trusting relationships, that we need to get data out, right? We heard in our morning plenary how John told us it's important to get that data out, those results out, because it builds trust in the system. That transparency is really important. But then there's also trust that needs to be built with community members, with advocates. We are a cross-sector room. We have election officials, government offices, nonprofit partners in the room, and we're learning how to build trust with each other. And I leave you with just some parting words. I hope you have experienced today a little bit about what the mission is of Future of California Elections, and that is that this work is really, really hard. It's bigger than any one office can take on alone, and that is why partnerships are essential to the strength of our democracy, to the strength of the Future of California Elections. Thank you, and enjoy the reception.